The Riverside Police Department's interrogation room falls silent as a disheveled man in worn clothing stands up, his demeanor suddenly shifting from submissive to commanding. Detective Ryan Dalton's confident smirk vanishes as the homeless witness he'd dismissed 30 minutes earlier removes a hidden recording device from his jacket. Detective Dalton, Captain Marcus Rivera, announces, his voice no longer carrying the slurred speech of someone intoxicated. "I'm Captain Marcus Rivera, Internal Affairs Division. I've just watched you plant narcotics in DeShawn Martinez's backpack, falsify your incident report, and coerce a false confession." The room freezes. Officer Kyle Brennan, Dalton's partner, goes pale. The young suspect, Martinez, stares in disbelief. "You just committed evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy, all while an IA commander documented everything." Rivera continues calmly. The detective, who moments ago wielded absolute authority, now faces the investigator who's been hunting him for months, and his career in law enforcement just ended. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 8 hours earlier, Captain Marcus Rivera had stood in the Internal Affairs conference room at Riverside Police Department headquarters, reviewing the most troubling case file of his 20-year career. At 43, Rivera had investigated everything from minor policy violations to major corruption rings. But Detective Ryan Dalton represented something particularly insidious, a decorated officer who had weaponized his badge to destroy innocent lives. Rivera had built Internal Affairs' reputation on thorough, unbiased investigations that held officers accountable while protecting those who served with integrity. His approach was methodical rather than sensational, focused on systematic reform rather than individual punishment alone. But Dalton's case demanded both: accountability for past victims and reforms to prevent future abuse. Detective Ryan Dalton had been with Riverside PD for 15 years, the last 8 in the Vice Squad, where he'd built an impressive arrest record. His conviction rate was exceptional. 92% of his arrests resulted in guilty pleas or convictions. The Oakmont District Attorney's Office considered him their most reliable officer for narcotics cases, and his testimony had sent dozens of defendants to prison. What the statistics didn't reveal, and what Rivera's investigation had uncovered over 6 months of painstaking work, was that Dalton's success was built on fabricated evidence, coerced confessions, and systematic civil rights violations. The detective had developed a pattern of targeting young men in the predominantly minority Westbrook district, planting narcotics during searches, and using the threat of harsh sentences to pressure guilty pleas, even from innocent defendants. Rivera's investigation had been triggered by attorney Jessica Moreno, a public defender who had noticed disturbing patterns in Dalton's cases. 3 defendants she'd represented had nearly identical stories: stopped for minor infractions, searched despite questionable probable cause, and found with small quantities of narcotics they insisted had been planted. Moreno had documented the similarities and brought them to Internal Affairs, despite knowing that challenging a decorated detective's credibility could damage her own professional reputation. Most concerning was that Dalton's misconduct appeared to have institutional enablers. His partner, Officer Kyle Brennan, was present for most of the questionable arrests, but had never reported concerns. Sergeant Paul Devereaux, their supervisor, had dismissed multiple civilian complaints as baseless accusations from criminals trying to avoid responsibility, and the precinct's culture seemed to prize conviction rates over constitutional policing, creating an environment where officers like Dalton could thrive. Rivera had spent months building his case, interviewing former defendants who'd taken plea deals rather than risk trial, analyzing body camera footage that showed suspicious gaps and edits, and consulting with forensic experts about evidence handling irregularities. But he needed undeniable proof, something that would survive the aggressive defense that the police union would mount and convince prosecutors to file criminal charges rather than just administrative violations. His solution was unconventional, but legally sound, going undercover to witness Dalton's misconduct firsthand. Rivera would pose as a homeless veteran in the Westbrook district, an area Dalton patrolled frequently, and create an opportunity for the detective to demonstrate his pattern of evidence planting. The operation had been approved by Police Chief Margaret Valdez, who was horrified by the allegations and committed to rooting out corruption even among decorated officers. The plan carried significant risks. If Dalton recognized Rivera or became suspicious, the entire investigation could collapse. If Rivera's cover was compromised, it could endanger both the undercover operation and future IA investigations. And there was always the possibility that Dalton had reformed his practices, or that the previous cases had been aberrations rather than patterns. But Rivera believed the risk was justified. Every day Dalton remained on the street was another day innocent people could be victimized by someone sworn to protect them. The badge that should represent justice had become a weapon of oppression in Dalton's hands, and that betrayal demanded action. Rivera had prepared meticulously for his undercover role. He'd grown a beard for 3 weeks, obtained authentically worn clothing from a homeless services organization, and studied the mannerisms and speech patterns of individuals experiencing homelessness and substance abuse. He carried concealed recording devices that met legal standards for IA investigations, along with backup communication equipment to summon his team if the situation became dangerous. The target location was a convenience store on the corner of 5th and Market in Westbrook, an area where Dalton had made numerous arrests and where Rivera's team had documented patterns of aggressive policing. The timing was chosen based on Dalton's shift schedule. He typically patrolled this area during evening hours, when foot traffic was heavy enough to provide cover but not so crowded that officers faced logistical challenges. As Rivera had positioned himself near the store that evening, appearing to panhandle while actually conducting surveillance, he reflected on what this investigation meant for Riverside PD. If Dalton's corruption was as systematic as evidence suggested, it meant the department had failed in its duty to supervise officers, investigate complaints, and maintain constitutional policing standards. Accountability couldn't stop with one detective. It needed to extend to the supervisors who enabled him and the systems that made his misconduct possible. What Rivera didn't know as he settled into his undercover position was that within hours, he would witness evidence planting even more blatant than he'd anticipated, that the victim would be a college student with no criminal record, and that Dalton's arrogance would lead him to commit multiple felonies while believing his authority made him untouchable. The detective, who thought his badge protected him from consequences, was about to discover that internal affairs had been watching all along. Marcus Rivera had been maintaining his homeless veteran cover outside the Westbrook Market for 90 minutes when he noticed DeShawn Martinez approaching the store. The 22-year-old was exactly the type of person Dalton typically targeted: young, black, wearing a college hoodie, and carrying a backpack that could plausibly contain contraband if an officer wanted to claim probable cause. Martinez entered the store to purchase a sports drink and snacks, his movements casual and unhurried. He was a business major at Oakmont State University, heading home after an evening study session at the campus library. His biggest concern was an upcoming accounting exam, not that he was about to become the victim of police corruption that would threaten to destroy his future. Detective Ryan Dalton's patrol car pulled up to the curb just as Martinez exited the store. Dalton, 38, had the confident bearing of someone who'd never faced meaningful accountability for his actions. His partner, Officer Kyle Brennan, sat in the passenger seat, displaying the passive compliance that had enabled Dalton's misconduct for years. "Hey, stop right there," Dalton called out. exiting his vehicle with the authoritative swagger that intimidated most civilians into immediate compliance. Martinez stopped, confused but cooperative.
"Yes, officer."
"Is there a problem? What's in the backpack?" Dalton asked, already positioning himself to control the encounter. "Just textbooks and my laptop." "I'm coming from the library," Martinez replied, his tone respectful, but showing the wariness that many young black men learn to adopt during police encounters. From his position 15 feet away, Rivera watched the interaction carefully, his concealed recording devices capturing both video and audio. This was exactly the type of stop that had preceded Dalton's previous questionable arrests. Minimal justification, immediate focus on searching for contraband, and a compliant victim unlikely to effectively challenge a police officer's authority. "I need to search that bag," Dalton stated, presenting it as fact rather than request. "Do I have to consent to that?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Martinez said, demonstrating more knowledge of his rights than Dalton typically encountered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question clearly irritated Dalton, who was accustomed to immediate compliance rather than citizens asserting constitutional protections. "I've got reasonable suspicion based on your nervous behavior and the high crime nature of this area. You can consent voluntarily, or I can detain you while I get a K-9 unit here. Your choice." The threat was legally questionable. Martinez had displayed no nervous behavior, and merely being in a particular neighborhood didn't constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. But the implicit message was clear: comply or face escalating consequences. Martinez, like many civilians confronted with police authority, chose compliance over confrontation. "Okay, you can search it." Rivera watched as Dalton took the backpack and began examining its contents: textbooks, notebooks, a laptop, pens, and the snacks Martinez had just purchased. Nothing remotely illegal or suspicious. For most officers, this would have ended the encounter with an apology for the inconvenience. But Dalton wasn't most officers. As he searched the bag's main compartment, Dalton positioned himself so that his body blocked Martinez's direct line of sight while his hands moved into the backpack. His partner Brennan had moved to engage Martinez in conversation about where he was coming from, a distraction technique that Rivera recognized from previous cases. Rivera's position gave him a clear angle that Martinez lacked. He watched as Dalton's hand moved to his duty belt, where a small plastic baggie disappeared into his palm with practiced efficiency, then deposited the baggie into a side pocket of Martinez's backpack that he then discovered moments later. Well, what do we have here?" Dalton announced, holding up a small baggie containing what appeared to be crack cocaine. "You want to explain this?" The color drained from Martinez's face. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before. You just put that in there." His accusation was exactly what Dalton expected and had heard dozens of times from actual guilty suspects. The detective's response was rehearsed and confident. "Son, I've been doing this 15 years. Everyone says the drugs aren't theirs. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance. I swear to God, that's not mine." Martinez's voice rose with panic as Brennan moved behind him to begin handcuffing. "You planted that. Someone must have seen it." Dalton glanced around the street. An elderly woman was entering the store, not paying attention to the police activity. A couple walked on the opposite sidewalk, focused on their conversation, and a homeless man sat against the building wall, appearing intoxicated and unlikely to be a credible witness even if he had noticed anything. The detective's assessment that there were no meaningful witnesses was both his tactical advantage and his critical mistake. He had no idea that the apparently intoxicated homeless man was actually an internal affairs captain with 20 years of investigation, experience in recording equipment documenting every moment of the evidence planting. "I know my rights." "I want a lawyer," Martinez demanded as Brennan secured his hands behind his back. "You'll get your phone call at the station," Dalton replied dismissively. "Right now, you're looking at felony possession. Given the quantity here, we're talking serious prison time unless you want to cooperate about where you got this and who you're selling to." The threat was designed to pressure a confession or cooperation, using the planted evidence as leverage to either build a larger case or secure a quick guilty plea. It was the same tactic Dalton had used successfully dozens of times. Plant small amounts of drugs, threaten harsh sentences, then offer reduced charges in exchange for guilty pleas that avoided trial and the scrutiny that might expose his misconduct. As they loaded the protesting Martinez into the patrol car, Dalton filled out an incident report that fabricated probable cause for the stop and search. Every detail was carefully crafted to appear legitimate, backed by his partner's corroborating statement and his own reputation as a reliable officer. What Dalton didn't realize was that his reliable reputation was about to be destroyed by the very evidence he thought he'd successfully manufactured. Marcus Rivera remained in his homeless veteran cover as Dalton's patrol car drove away with DeShawn Martinez in custody. His immediate instinct was to reveal himself and stop the illegal arrest. But doing so would only save one victim, while allowing Dalton to claim the evidence planting was an isolated incident. Rivera needed the detective to continue the pattern, to process the arrest, file false reports, and attempt to coerce a confession. Only then would the full scope of corruption be undeniable. He activated his concealed communication device. Rivera to command. Witnessed evidence planting. Subject now in custody. Proceeding to Phase 2, Inspector Patricia Hartwell's voice crackled back through his earpiece. "Copy that, Captain." Legal team standing by. "We'll track booking and ensure the victim isn't pressured into any statements before we intervene." Rivera stood slowly, maintaining his disheveled appearance as he made his way toward Riverside PD headquarters 15 blocks away. His team had prepared for this scenario. Attorney Jessica Moreno was on standby to represent Martinez the moment he requested counsel, preventing Dalton from securing the coerced confession that usually sealed these cases. Meanwhile, at Precinct 7's booking facility, Dalton processed Martinez with the efficient routine of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Officer Kyle Brennan completed the evidence chain of custody forms, documenting the planted narcotics as though they'd been legitimately discovered. Desk Sergeant Paul Devereaux accepted the paperwork without question, his implicit trust in Dalton's integrity enabling the corruption to continue unchallenged. "I want my phone call," Martinez insisted as Brennan fingerprinted him. "And I want a lawyer before I answer any questions." His invocation of rights should have ended all interrogation. But Dalton had become skilled at skirting legal protections through casual conversation that elicited incriminating statements without appearing to be formal questioning. "You'll get your call," Dalton assured him with false sympathy. "Look, DeShawn, I've been doing this a long time. I can tell the difference between dealers and users who made a mistake. If you cooperate about where you got the stuff, I can talk to the DA about reducing charges. But if you make this difficult, you're looking at 3 to 5 years mandatory minimum." The threat was designed to terrify a college student with no criminal record into making admissions that would be documented as voluntary statements rather than interrogation responses. Martinez had no way of knowing that Dalton's promises about charge reduction were meaningless, since the detective had no intention of admitting the evidence was planted. "I already told you. Those drugs aren't mine," Martinez repeated, his voice breaking with stress. "You put them in my bag. I want a lawyer right now." His continued assertion of rights frustrated Dalton, who was accustomed to fear overriding legal knowledge. "Suit yourself. But you're going to county lockup for the weekend since it's Friday evening. Judge won't see you until Monday. 3 days to think about how cooperation could have kept you out of jail." The threat of weekend detention was another pressure tactic, designed to make the consequences of asserting rights seem worse than the consequences of Cooperation. What Dalton didn't know was that attorney Jessica Moreno had been alerted the moment Martinez was booked and was already en route to the precinct. More significantly, he had no idea that Captain Rivera had entered the building through a staff entrance, shed his homeless disguise in an IA office, and was now reviewing the booking paperwork that documented Dalton's fabricated arrest. Rivera studied the incident report with professional disgust. Dalton had claimed that Martinez displayed furtive movements upon seeing the patrol car, provided evasive answers about his destination, and consented to the backpack search, all complete fabrications contradicted by Rivera's recording. "He's getting better at creative writing," Inspector Hartwell observed, reading over Rivera's shoulder. "That report would probably survive cursory review, which is exactly why this has continued for years," Rivera replied grimly. "Supervisors see impressive arrest numbers and detailed reports, never questioning whether the underlying facts are true." Jessica Moreno arrived at the precinct and immediately demanded to see her client. Desk Sergeant Devereaux tried to delay her access, claiming Martinez was still being processed, but Moreno knew the law too well to accept deflection. "My client has invoked his right to counsel. Any questioning after that invocation violates Miranda. I'm seeing him now, or I'm filing a federal civil rights complaint within the hour." Her forceful advocacy got her into the holding area, where she found Martinez sitting in a cell, visibly shaken but not yet broken by Dalton's intimidation tactics. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. "I bag when I couldn't see, then pulled them out like he'd found them," Martinez explained, relief evident in his voice that someone believed him. "I believe you," Moreno said. "And more importantly, Internal Affairs has been investigating this officer for months. What happened to you tonight wasn't random. It was a pattern they've been documenting. You're going to be okay." Back in the booking area, Dalton was completing his shift paperwork when Sergeant Devereaux mentioned that Martinez had lawyered up immediately and that Jessica Moreno was representing him. The news should have concerned Dalton. Moreno was known for aggressively challenging police testimony and filing complaints about misconduct. But his arrogance, built on years of facing no consequences, led him to dismiss the threat. "Doesn't matter," Dalton told his partner. "We've got the evidence, we've got proper chain of custody, and we've got our testimony. Some public defender isn't going to convince a jury that two cops with clean records planted evidence on a random college kid. His confidence in his untouchability would prove to be catastrophically misplaced." Within the next 30 minutes, while Dalton completed his arrest paperwork with casual confidence, Captain Rivera's hidden recording had triggered a comprehensive response that extended far beyond Precinct 7. The evidence planting he'd witnessed represented not just individual corruption, but a systematic failure that demanded immediate intervention across multiple institutions. In the Internal Affairs Command Center, Inspector Patricia Hartwell coordinated with a team of investigators who had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. Detective Raymond Brooks pulled up Dalton's complete case history, 247 arrests over 8 years, with 227 resulting in convictions or guilty pleas. The exceptional success rate that had earned Dalton commendations and promotions now appeared as evidence of systematic misconduct. "We need to review every single conviction," Brooks told Hartwell. "If he planted evidence tonight, he's done it before. There could be dozens of innocent people in prison based on fabricated charges. The implications were staggering. Each wrongful conviction represented a destroyed life, a family torn apart, and a community's trust in law enforcement betrayed. Beyond the individual tragedies, there was massive legal exposure, civil rights lawsuits, federal investigations, and potential criminal charges against everyone who had enabled Dalton's corruption. Dr. Lauren Sinclair, The department's psychologist reviewed Dalton's personnel file, looking for warning signs that had been missed. He shows classic traits of someone who's rationalized misconduct as justified enforcement. His internal memos talk about getting drugs off the street by any means necessary and not letting technicalities protect criminals. That language suggests he genuinely believes planting evidence serves a greater good. The psychology explained, but didn't excuse Dalton's actions. Many officers faced frustration with legal constraints without resorting to fabricating evidence. Dalton had chosen corruption over integrity, then built elaborate justifications for his choices. Police Chief Margaret Valdez received Hartwell's briefing with a mixture of fury and devastation. At 57, Valdez had spent 33 years building Riverside PD's reputation for professional policing. Learning that a decorated detective had been systematically violating civil rights under her command felt like a personal failure of leadership. "How did our oversight systems miss this for 8 years?" she demanded. "We have body cameras, chain of custody procedures, civilian complaint processes. Where did every safeguard fail?" Attorney David Cho, the department's legal counsel, had already begun analyzing the systematic failures. Body camera footage shows suspicious gaps in several of Dalton's arrests. Cameras were turned off during searches or angled away from his hands. Chain of custody was technically proper because his partner always corroborated his version of events. And civilian complaints were dismissed as unreliable because they came from defendants with criminal histories or pending charges. Each explanation revealed how Dalton had exploited the system's weaknesses. Policies designed to protect both officers and civilians had been circumvented through coordination with his partner, manipulation of recording equipment, and exploitation of implicit bias that made supervisors trust police testimony over defendant accusations. Meanwhile, freelance journalist Nina Patel had been following Riverside PD's Vice Squad for a story about narcotics enforcement in minority communities. She'd been having coffee across from the Westbrook Market when she witnessed Dalton's stop of Martinez, and something about the interaction had struck her as wrong. The body language suggested intimidation rather than lawful investigation, and Martinez's visible distress seemed disproportionate to the casual stop of someone walking home from the library. Patel had photographed the encounter on her phone, capturing images of Dalton searching the backpack while Brennan distracted Martinez. Her photographs didn't clearly show the evidence planting. Her angle hadn't been ideal, but they documented the timeline and circumstances that would corroborate Rivera's recording. She began researching Dalton's arrest record and discovered troubling patterns. His arrests were concentrated in Westbrook, a predominantly black and Latino neighborhood, despite narcotics use occurring at similar rates across all demographics. His suspects were overwhelmingly young men of color, and his cases rarely went to trial. Most ended in guilty pleas, suggesting defendants feared conviction more than they trusted the justice system to expose police misconduct. Patel's investigation was independently reaching the same conclusions. That Internal Affairs had spent months documenting Dalton's policing was racially disparate and constitutionally questionable. She began drafting an article that would put public pressure on Riverside PD to address these patterns. Unaware that IA was already preparing to arrest the detective within hours, back at Precinct 7, Officer Amelia Wong watched Dalton complete his paperwork with growing internal conflict. Wong, 29, had worked with Dalton for 2 years and had witnessed several arrests where suspects claimed planted evidence. She dismissed these accusations, trusting her training officer's experience and reputation. But tonight something felt different. Martinez's genuine confusion and terror, the convenient location of drugs in an outer pocket that the student claimed he never used, and Dalton's immediate shift to coercing cooperation rather than simply processing a routine arrest. Wong had been raised to respect authority and trust fellow officers, values that made her an effective team member. but also left her vulnerable to rationalizing misconduct. She wanted to report her concerns, but feared the professional consequences of accusing a decorated detective without proof. Her hesitation represented exactly the cultural problem that allowed corruption to thrive. Good officers, who suspected wrongdoing but lacked the institutional support or courage to challenge it. What Wong didn't know was that her concerns would soon be validated in the most dramatic way possible, and that her choice in the coming hours would determine whether she became part of the solution or remained complicit in the problem. As multiple threads converged on Precinct 7, Rivera preparing to confront Dalton, Moreno protecting Martinez's rights, Patel investigating patterns of misconduct, and IA mobilizing comprehensive intervention, the detective who believed his authority made him untouchable was about to discover that accountability had finally caught up with his corruption. Captain Marcus Rivera stood in the Internal Affairs office, now wearing his official uniform with captain's bars clearly visible, reviewing his legal authority to intervene. Attorney David Cho had confirmed that Rivera's undercover observation and recording constituted admissible evidence for both criminal prosecution and disciplinary action. More importantly, they had grounds for immediate arrest rather than merely administrative investigation. "We go now," Rivera decided. "Martinez has been in custody for 40 minutes based on fabricated evidence. Every additional minute he's detained compounds the civil rights violation." Inspector Hartwell assembled the intervention team, herself, Detective Brooks, and 2 IA investigators who would document everything. Police Chief Valdez insisted on being present personally, understanding that Dalton's arrest would send shockwaves through the department, and wanting officers to see leadership taking direct responsibility for accountability. They entered the booking area, where Dalton sat at a desk, completing supplementary reports about Martinez's arrest. His casual confidence evaporated the moment he saw Chief Valdez flanked by IA investigators, their expressions making clear this wasn't a routine visit. "Detective Dalton," Valdez began, her voice carrying the weight of command and disappointment. "Please stand up and step away from the desk." Dalton stood slowly, professional instinct telling him to comply, even as confusion showed on his face. "Chief Valdez, I'm not sure what this is about." "This is about the arrest you just made," Rivera said, stepping forward into Dalton's line of sight. "The arrest of DeShawn Martinez, who you stopped outside Westbrook Market approximately 50 minutes ago." Dalton's eyes narrowed as he studied Rivera, clearly trying to place the face that seemed vaguely familiar but not immediately recognizable out of the homeless disguise context. "That was a clean arrest," Dalton replied defensively. "Subject had crack cocaine in his backpack." "Everything was by the book, really?" Rivera asked. "Because I was there, Detective. I watched the entire encounter." Recognition flickered across Dalton's expression, the homeless man who'd been sitting against the building wall. But instead of alarm, his face showed irritation at what he perceived as an unreliable witness creating problems. "If some homeless guy is claiming he saw something, that's not exactly credible testimony," Dalton scoffed. "I don't know what he told you, but I can assure you my arrest was legitimate." Rivera let the dismissive comment hang in the air before responding. "Detective Dalton, I'm Captain Marcus Rivera, Internal Affairs Division. I wasn't some random homeless witness. I was conducting an authorized undercover operation, investigating allegations of evidence planting and civil rights violations. And I watched you plant narcotics in DeShawn Martinez's backpack." The revelation hit Dalton like a physical blow. His confident posture collapsed, his face drained of color, and his mouth opened without producing sound. The realization that his career-ending mistake had been witnessed by a captain conducting an official investigation was overwhelming. Officer Kyle Brennan, who had been completing his own paperwork nearby, looked equally stricken. His complicity in Dalton's corruption was about to face the same consequences. That's not what happened," Dalton stammered, attempting denial even as his body language betrayed his guilt. "I found drugs during a consensual search. This is some kind of mistake." Inspector Hartwell stepped forward with a tablet displaying preliminary footage from Rivera's hidden camera. "This video shows you removing a plastic baggie from your duty belt and placing it into the outer pocket of Martinez's backpack. Moments later, you discovered that same baggie and arrested him for possession. That's evidence tampering, civil rights deprivation, and official misconduct at minimum. The video evidence eliminated any possibility of talking his way out of the situation, but Dalton's instinct was still to deflect and minimize. Even if the video shows something that looks questionable, my partner can corroborate my version of events. It's our word against some recording that doesn't show the full context." "Actually," Chief Valdez interjected coldly, "is a captain's sworn testimony, authenticated video evidence, and a victim who will testify about what you did. Officer Brennan's corroboration just means he's facing obstruction charges along with you." Brennan's face went pale as he realized his complicity was bringing the same consequences as Dalton's active misconduct. Detective Brooks read from his preliminary investigation summary. "Detective Dalton, our review of your arrest record over 8 years shows 227 convictions with an unusually high percentage of guilty pleas. We've identified at least 17 cases with similar patterns to tonight's arrest. Stops of young minority men in Westbrook, searches of backpacks or vehicles, discovery of drugs in locations suspects claim were previously empty, and subsequent guilty pleas to avoid trial. We believe tonight's evidence planting represents a systematic pattern spanning years. The scope of allegations expanded beyond a single incident into institutional corruption, transforming Dalton from an officer who made one terrible mistake into someone who had built an entire career on fabricated evidence." "I want my union representative," Dalton finally said, abandoning attempts to justify himself and retreating into legal protection. "You'll have access to representation," Valdez confirmed. "But first, you're under arrest for evidence tampering, deprivation of rights under color of law, and official misconduct. Additional charges will be filed as our investigation continues." The statement that Dalton was under arrest, that his authority was being stripped, and he was being treated as a criminal suspect, represented a complete power reversal. The detective who had wielded his badge as a weapon now faced the justice system he'd corrupted. As IA investigators prepared to handcuff Dalton, Rivera made one final observation. "You asked Martinez what was in his backpack and insisted on searching it. You told him he could consent or face escalating consequences. That's exactly what you're experiencing now, the consequences of your choices. The difference is your guilt is real and documented. It was fabricated by you." As officers escorted Dalton toward a holding cell, the same cells where his victims had been detained based on his lies, he made one final attempt to justify himself. "Everything I did was to get drugs off the streets, to protect communities from dealers and addicts. The ends justified the means when the legal system was letting criminals walk free on technicalities." Rivera stepped directly in front of Dalton, stopping the escort. "You don't get to claim noble intentions, detective. You didn't plant evidence on actual drug dealers. You targeted innocent people because they were easy victims who fit your prejudice profile of what a criminal looks like. DeShawn Martinez is a college student with no criminal record. How did destroying his life protect anyone?" The question hung in the air, exposing the hollowness of Dalton's rationalization. "And even if your victims had been guilty," Chief Valdez added, "fabricating evidence isn't crime fighting, it's crime committing. You became exactly what you claimed to oppose, someone who victimizes communities and destroys lives. The only difference is you did it while wearing a badge, which makes your betrayal even worse." As Dalton was led away, the gathered officers stood in stunned silence, processing what they'd witnessed. The arrest of a decorated detective by Internal Affairs. The revelation of systematic evidence planting. and the public accountability from the chief represented a seismic shift in precinct culture. Officer Wong approached Martinez hesitantly. "Mr. Martinez, I'm sorry. I was there tonight when other arrests happened that seemed questionable, and I didn't speak up. That's on me, and I'm sorry you had to experience this." Her apology to the victim, witnessed by her colleagues, modeled the accountability that would need to become institutional practice rather than exceptional behavior. The following morning, Chief Margaret Valdez convened an emergency assembly of all Riverside Police Department personnel. Over 400 officers, detectives, and civilian staff gathered in the Civic Center auditorium. The atmosphere was tense with uncertainty about what Dalton's arrest meant for the department's future and individual officers' careers. Yesterday, Captain Marcus Rivera of Internal Affairs arrested Detective Ryan Dalton for planting evidence on an innocent civilian. Valdez began without preamble. "Some of you worked with Dalton. Some of you considered him a friend. All of you deserve to understand what happened, why it happened, and how we're going to ensure it never happens again." She displayed Rivera's undercover footage on the massive screen behind her, the video clearly showing Dalton removing a baggie from his belt and placing it in Martinez's backpack before discovering it moments later. The visual evidence was undeniable and devastating. "This wasn't a mistake or an isolated incident," Valdez continued. "Our investigation has identified at least 17 similar cases over 8 years where innocent people were arrested based on fabricated evidence. That means 17 lives destroyed, 17 families torn apart, and 17 reasons for our community to question whether they can trust police officers to serve with integrity." The scope of Dalton's corruption silenced the murmurs that had begun when the footage started playing. Officers who had worked alongside Dalton looked stricken, processing the realization that a colleague's systematic misconduct had occurred under their noses. Patrol Officer Marcus Thompson raised his hand. "Chief, many of us had no idea this was happening. How do we rebuild trust with communities when they now have documented proof that some officers plant evidence?" The question was brave and necessary, acknowledging the broader damage rather than defensively protecting the institution. "That's exactly the right question," Valdez responded. "We rebuild trust through radical transparency and accountability. We're releasing the full IA investigation report to the public. We're inviting the DOJ to conduct an independent review of our practices. We're creating a civilian oversight board with subpoena power to investigate complaints. And we're implementing reforms that make it functionally impossible for another Dalton to operate unchecked." Inspector Hartwell outlined the specific reforms being implemented immediately. Mandatory body cameras that couldn't be manually disabled, with footage automatically flagged for review if cameras were turned off during civilian encounters. Randomized integrity testing where IA would stage scenarios to assess officer responses to ethical dilemmas. Anonymous reporting systems for officers to report colleague misconduct without fear of retaliation. And revised evaluation criteria that weighted constitutional policing equally with arrest statistics. Additionally, Chief Valdez announced, Sergeant Paul Devereaux has been demoted to patrol officer for supervisory failures that enabled Dalton's misconduct to continue. He dismissed civilian complaints without meaningful investigation and prioritized conviction rates over constitutional compliance. That negligent supervision was institutional failure, and it's being addressed. The technological reforms extended beyond body cameras. All evidence collected during arrests was now photographed in place before being moved, with photos time-stamped and geolocated to prevent post-collection tampering. Chain of custody documentation required signatures from both the arresting officer and a witnessing officer, with any single officer evidence collection triggering automatic supervisory review. Detective Raymond Brooks led an investigation into Officer Kyle Brennan's complicity. ultimately determining that Brennan had actively enabled Dalton's evidence planting through distraction tactics and false corroboration. He was charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights and terminated from the department. His prosecution sent a clear message that passive participation in corruption carried nearly identical consequences to active misconduct. Sergeant Devereaux, demoted to patrol officer, became an unexpected advocate for reform. I failed as a supervisor because I measured success by statistics rather than constitutional compliance, he told officers during a training session. I dismissed civilian complaints as criminals trying to avoid responsibility instead of investigating whether they might be legitimate. That negligence enabled Dalton to destroy lives. Don't make my mistakes. Trust but verify. Question patterns that seem suspicious. And remember that our authority depends on exercising it with integrity. His candid acknowledgement of supervisory failures helped create a culture where admitting mistakes was viewed as strength rather than weakness, enabling continuous improvement rather than defensive self-protection. Nina Patel published a comprehensive investigative series in the Oakmont Chronicle, documenting both Dalton's corruption and Riverside PD's accountability response. How police corruption was exposed and how one department chose reform over denial became required reading in criminal justice programs nationally, showcasing the case as a model for institutional accountability. 6 months after DeShawn Martinez's false arrest, Captain Marcus Rivera returned to Westbrook to assess whether the reforms implemented after Dalton's exposure had produced genuine cultural transformation or merely temporary compliance that would fade once public attention diminished. Captain Rivera, an elderly woman, approached him outside the Westbrook market. You're the one who caught that crooked cop, right? Thank you. My grandson was arrested by Dalton 2 years ago. He's been saying the drugs were planted ever since, and now we know he was telling the truth. He's getting out of prison next month because of what you did. Her gratitude was personal and specific, connecting the abstract concept of police accountability to a family being reunited after wrongful imprisonment. The conviction. Integrity Unit had ultimately exonerated 23 people who had been imprisoned based on Dalton's fabricated evidence. 23 individuals who had lost years of their lives, missed children's milestones, and carried felony records that destroyed employment prospects, all based on one detective's systematic corruption, enabled by inadequate oversight. DeShawn Martinez had returned to Oakmont State University and, remarkably, remained committed to pursuing a career in law enforcement. He was interning with the Civilian Oversight Board, bringing a victim's perspective to accountability mechanisms. I'm more convinced than ever that policing needs good people, Martinez told Rivera during a chance encounter at police headquarters. But I'm also convinced that good individuals aren't enough without good systems. What happened to me wasn't just Dalton being corrupt. It was supervisors not questioning his statistics, body camera policies that allowed strategic gaps in coverage, and a culture that dismissed civilian complaints. Fixing those systems matters as much as punishing individual bad officers. His sophisticated analysis of institutional failures impressed Rivera, who recognized that Martinez's experience had given him insights that many career officers never developed. Officer Amelia Wong's reformed. Vice Squad had made 147 arrests in the 6 months since Dalton's removal, with 0 complaints about planted evidence or constitutional violations. Her insistence on dual camera documentation and witness searches had initially slowed operations but had ultimately built community trust that made investigations more effective. People in Westbrook are actually calling us with tips now, Wong reported during a reform assessment meeting. They trust that we're investigating real crimes rather than manufacturing them. That cooperation has made us more effective at actual drug interdiction than Dalton's fabrication approach ever was. Her experience validated the principle that constitutional policing was both ethically right and operationally superior to rights violations, contradicting the false dichotomy between civil liberties and public safety. The Civilian Oversight Board's comprehensive audit had produced uncomfortable findings about systematic disparities in Riverside PD's policing, but Chief Valdez had responded with transparency rather than defensiveness. The department published the full audit report and implemented 37 specific reforms addressing identified problems, from revising stop and search training to creating demographic data tracking for all civilian encounters. Dr. Sharon Hayes, the Oversight Board Chair, acknowledged the department's good faith efforts. No institution enjoys having its failures publicly documented, but Riverside PD has responded to criticism with genuine reform rather than defensive denial. That willingness to change is the foundation of legitimate accountability. Her external validation helped officers accept reforms as legitimate improvements rather than punitive impositions. Fostering buy-in rather than resentment, Reverend Marcus Thompson, the Westbrook community leader, organized a reconciliation event where officers and residents shared experiences and rebuilt relationships damaged by years of aggressive policing. Officer Wong participated, listening to community members describe how Dalton's targeting had made them fear police rather than viewing officers as protectors. I never thought about how one corrupt cop's actions affect every officer's ability to do legitimate work, one young officer reflected after hearing residents' testimonies. When people assume we're all planting evidence, it makes even constitutional stops feel adversarial. Holding Dalton accountable wasn't just about punishing him. It was about protecting the integrity of officers who police legitimately. Detective Ryan Dalton, meanwhile, had been convicted on 17 counts of civil rights deprivation and evidence tampering. His 15-year federal prison sentence was significantly harsher than typical corruption cases, with the judge citing the systematic nature of his misconduct and the lives destroyed by his fabricated evidence. You violated the public trust in the most fundamental way. Judge Patricia Morrison stated during sentencing, citizens must be able to trust that evidence presented against them is genuine rather than manufactured. Your betrayal of that trust demands severe consequences to reaffirm that the rule of law applies equally to those who enforce it. Kyle Brennan received an 8-year sentence for conspiracy, while Sergeant Devereaux faced no criminal charges but carried the professional disgrace of his demotion and the knowledge that his negligent supervision had enabled years of injustice. On Rivera's final evening reviewing the reform implementation, Chief Valdez joined him for coffee at a diner across from police headquarters. "You think the changes will stick?" she asked. "Or will we gradually slide back to prioritizing statistics over constitutional compliance once the publicity fades?" Rivera considered carefully before responding. "That depends on whether we've changed hearts or just policies. Policies create frameworks for accountability, but culture determines whether those frameworks get honored or circumvented. The real test is what happens when officers face situations where violating rights would be easier than respecting them, whether they choose integrity even when nobody's watching." He gestured toward the Westbrook neighborhood, visible through the diner window. "Those residents are watching, though. They know what accountability looks like now. They've seen that internal affairs can catch corrupt cops, that chiefs can choose transparency over denial, and that civilians can challenge police misconduct and actually be believed. That knowledge creates expectations that will pressure continued reform, even if internal commitment wavers." Chief Valdez nodded slowly. "So the victims of Dalton's corruption become the guardians against future corruption by refusing to accept less than constitutional policing." "Exactly," Rivera confirmed. DeShawn Martinez didn't just survive false arrest. He became an intern for civilian oversight. Marcus Williams didn't just accept exoneration. He's testifying before City Council about reform needs. The community isn't waiting for police to grant them accountability anymore. They're demanding it as a right. That's the transformation that makes backsliding impossible. Whether that choice would endure beyond the immediate crisis remained to be seen. But for the 23 people freed from wrongful imprisonment, for DeShawn Martinez, who could return to his studies without a fabricated criminal record, and for Westbrook residents who could call police without fearing planted evidence, the accountability was already transformative, and that transformation, however imperfect and incomplete, represented progress worth fighting to sustain. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.